Hello, hello, hello. Hey, friends, how's it going? Thanks for spending time with us today. There is a lot of exciting stuff happening right now in the .NET space, especially in the cloud. And I was thinking about this term 10x developers and how much I dislike it. How we create this mythology around what someone who is a 10 times better developer than another person is. And I was realizing what a completely mediocre developer that I am and how I have been able to succeed in my career because of the tools that have made me better. And they've made me more successful and they've made me happier. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and we'll drop into the command line. I like to drive stick shift sometimes, and I'll spend some time in Visual Studio, but I wanted to go and explore a couple of things because I was realizing in the creation and maintenance of my websites and my blog and my podcast over the years. These are small sites that I have. We've got hanselminutes.com right here, and then I've got my Hanselman homepage, and then I've got my blog. These are all .NET applications, and the website's now been up for, gosh, 20 plus years, and I started in .NET 1 and then 1.1, and now we're moving into 6, 7, and 8. Sometimes people can feel a little bit overwhelmed. And I'm running all of these sites kind of on the side, doing my own thing, and I'm using Azure to do it. And in the process, I'm feeling really productive, both in the development of it, but also in the running of the site. And it's actually the tooling and some good practices, some good best practices that have allowed me to be successful. And I'm realizing that I wasn't using the tools enough. For a while, my websites here that were running in Azure were not very well run. They were not very well source controlled, and I wasn't taking advantage of some of the opportunities that I had to me. First thing that I had happen was, for example, on the Handsome Minutes podcast site, of which there are now, gosh, almost 900 episodes of really cool people, including a great show this week where we talk about Visual Studio Code that we're going to see a lot of folks using with our Azure developers day to day. The website, I didn't feel like I could trust it. I didn't know what was live in production. I didn't know which version of .NET I was using because I was using App Service. I wasn't paying really close attention to it, and I wouldn't update the site for a couple of weeks, and then I would go, "Gosh, when was the last time I deployed?" Or what's in production right now? And then if something went wrong with the site, I never really felt like I could understand if it was me or not. So I made a couple of interesting changes that I think I might want to share with you. First, I did something that Damian Edwards suggested. Down here in the footer, you'll notice a couple things. Now, I don't necessarily recommend this to everyone, but I think it's an interesting tool. I'm putting in the version of .NET, the runtime, in the footer, and I've also got down here the commit hash for my GitHub kit, my Git commit, and the actual log from Azure DevOps. So I went and took this website and I made sure that I had that code in Git and GitHub. I hooked it up with, in my case, Azure DevOps, although some of my other sites use GitHub Actions. And then by putting this information here, which helps me. Now, some people might say you shouldn't put that stuff there. That's actually behind passwords. That's behind passwords. And maybe that's a security problem. So if you wanted to, a best practice would be to have an if I'm logged in or if is admin. I understand that the folks that work on Stack Overflow do similar things like this. So if you are an employee of Stack Overflow, you would see a different website than if you were not, and then you would see additional diagnostics information. So imagine a footer on your website that shows diagnostics for you. And I'm calling this diagnostics in this case because it's helping me better understand my system. So on this one, I've got .NET 6, and I'll be upgrading to .NET 7. And then this commit, I can go and right click on, and I'm going to use Edge. I have two different profiles. I've got personal and I've got work. I'm going to right click on that and say open as work. And then when I pull that over here, you can see that just last week I made a small change, and I can go directly into GitHub, see that I made just a little text change on a Razor page. And that's the commit that's currently in production, which is really cool. And then if we look at this link here, that build, go ahead and open that, and that's going to take me over into Azure DevOps. We'll do a quick login, and I'm going to see the actual results of the build. You can see it was a 2-minute and 25-second build with a published artifact. That's the thing that actually got published on the site. And then we'll click down here in jobs. And then this is where things really get fun. So down here, I'm actually seeing, remember, I got here from production, the pipeline that ran, and I've recently set up Playwright. So in Playwright, I'm going to be doing testing in Azure DevOps as well. So you can see in my Azure DevOps where we're bringing in the .NET Core SDK. In this case, I am explicitly using .NET 6 as I get ready to make my move to 7. I go and install Playwright at the command line. So I'm using XUnit and NUnit to do my regular unit testing, and then I'm also doing Playwright testing, which is cool. We'll go and build those tests. I go and run the Playwright tests, which goes and does headless testing in the cloud, test it, publish it, and then the publishing here is going to go and publish into a zip file, and then that zip file is the artifact, right? So we've produced a build artifact in Azure DevOps, and then we're going to push that over to Azure. Now in Azure, I used to make the mistake of one app service plan equals one app. And I thought that that was obvious, that I should just have one app service plan to one app, but I realized I was giving money away. I didn't want to waste money. This is a side website. I'd like to make it as cheap as possible. So I realized that I want to look at my CPU percentage and my memory percentage in Azure portal, and I want to treat what's happening in Azure differently than I would treat a physical machine. If you were on a physical machine that was constantly at 40% CPU with memory memory pressure or memory percentage almost 70%, you might say, this machine is working too hard. I need more headroom. I'd like to see that CPU down here in the 10% range, or maybe I want my memory pressure under 50%. But that is an old way of thinking. That is a non-cloud way of thinking. The cloud is just a funny word for other people's computers. And I would very much like this machine to work hard because I'm renting it. It's that same reason that you drive a rental car differently than you drive a car that you bought with your own money. You tend to abuse a rental car. So I'm going to be okay with that CPU percentage. And I'm looking at this and thinking, how many websites can I fit in this Azure App Service? So what I've ended up doing is saving a ton of money by, and it's counterintuitive, I know. I used to have multiple basic plans with one app per, and now I have actually a premium plan. I've got this P1 V2. We'll go ahead and click on that and look at the hardware for that app service plan. So you can go in here and see these production plans. So rather than a bunch of $25 plans, for me, I switched to this plan, which is premium, and I'm thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be expensive. Well, it's 3 times more than basic, but I'm actually running, go ahead and look at our resource group here, a ton of stuff in there. So when we click on the app service plan and look at that, we've actually got 4 individual websites running on the premium. So I've got the blog, I've got the homepage, I've got the podcast, and I'm actually running Azure Friday. So now, for 3 times the cost, I'm running 4 times the website. So I'm actually saving $25 a month, and I'm getting way better perf, and arguably have a little bit more headroom there, and could probably run another small site. So all 4 of those sites are running happily on that app service plan, and that was a big move for me. That was a big deal. Now I also want to point out here that runtime stack. That runtime stack is being managed, right? Not on the app service plan layer, but actually on the app by app. So let's go and look at that, and we'll go and take a look at configuration. And then I'm going to hit general settings. And you can see here, we've actually got .NET 7 ready to go, which is going to make it nice when I switch one of my sites from 6 to 7. And all my sites are different right now. If we look at the home page, you can see that I'm powered by 6014, that runtime. But if we look at the podcast, we're on 6015. So that little bit of context gets me more confidence about like what exactly is going on right now, what's in production. It also calls out the difference between the SDK and the runtime. And I'm seeing those numbers go up as I watch new versions of .NET roll out for my applications. Sorry if you're seeing my mouse jump around a little bit, my friends. We've got a little bug here in our screen sharing that's causing that to happen. So my apologies. So here I'm going to swap out to the command line. As I was mentioning, I like to drive stick shift, and I've taken the Hanselman site and I've gone and made a Docker file. So I'm going to just go ahead and open that up. I could open it up in Visual Studio. I could open it up in Visual Studio Code. In this case, it doesn't really matter that much. And I'm going to just show you this Docker file. We'll go ahead and we'll zoom in a little bit there. You can see that we've got .NET SDK 6. So we're doing a multi-stage build. The first stage is going to be to build our application. We're going to build it, and this is really interesting. We're building it inside the Docker container, right? So we didn't build on our Windows machine. We're building inside of Docker. We're copying our code into there. And then that build happening inside the Docker container, which means I could theoretically do everything in Docker if it made me happy, maybe using some of the remote extensions for Visual Studio Code. And then I'm actually going to install Playwright, which is my tester. That's happening inside of that Docker container on another layer using a building. I'm going to test everything. We're going to test everything, publish it into a folder called out. But this is multi-stage. When we say multi-stage, it's a multi-stage Docker if you have those words from multiple times. So at the very top there, we started at the .NET 6 SDK. We did all of our work, our building, our testing. We published into that out folder right there. Okay. Then we're moving now to the ASP.NET 6 runtime. Now this is important. Notice that I called it as runtime, but up here it's SDK as build. Very, very different. That's because there's no reason for me to go and ship the SDK, the DLLs, the libraries that I don't need. I don't need to ship the compiler. There's no reason to put the C# compiler inside of a Docker runtime. I'm just going to use the bare minimum. And you can decide how bare minimum you want to be. We've got a bunch of really cool stuff happening in the Docker space right now with what are called chiseled containers that have as little surface area as possible with our friends from Canonical and Ubuntu. You're going to see a lot of really interesting innovations where Docker containers get smaller and smaller. .NET in .NET 7 and 8 get smaller and smaller as we include things like AOT. And that's going to allow me to have even more density. We're going to see both on disk sizes go down, and then I could potentially think about my memory footprint, and the less libraries and less stuff that's happening in memory, the smaller and smaller my application's runtime gets. Now I can publish more densely and maybe fit another website or two into that. And remember, I've already paid for that Azure App Service. So if I can fit another website in there, that's just free. That's just free money. So then we publish that and we have our opening entry point. So that's a pretty basic multi-tier, multi-stage Docker file. And then we go back over into Azure. I've got choices. It's Azure App Service. When I make an app service, as you'll recall, we can go and make a web app. We've got choices. Those web apps can be done as code, where the build happens up in the cloud, as a Docker container, as a static web app. We can choose Linux or Windows. Lots of different choices. Also, switching over to Linux in the cloud saved me some money, which was pretty cool. It was about 30% cheaper. So how did I test that? How did I go from Windows over to Linux? Well, if we switch back to the command line here, I can say .NET build. Here we are on Windows. I'm building on .NET 7 because I'm going to start testing. You can see in my prompt, we've got the current folder. We've got my current Git branch. And then I've put the version of .NET in this folder, .NET 7. I'm on a preview of .NET 7. And then for those that are paying attention, I've also got my blood sugar right there, because when I'm working, sometimes I lose track of what my blood sugar is, and I like to keep up on that. So here I'm in Windows doing that build, but I'm also using WSL, and I'm using the Windows terminal. So we see Ubuntu appearing right there in my dropdown. I'm actually going to pull that down. I'm going to hold down Alt with my left thumb, and then with my right hand, I'm going to click on Ubuntu. So I'm going Alt, click. Now look, on the left we have PowerShell on Windows, and now on the right, we've got Ubuntu. Look at that. So here I just did my .NET build. Over here on the side, let's go into another folder. And this is an important thing for you to think about if you're using WSL yourself. You're not going to want to use the Windows file system. If you're on Linux, you're going to want to use the Linux file system. So how do I move stuff between these two folders that are really the same folder? Well, I treat it like a different machine. So I'm going to use a git pull. I'm going to bring that information down just like I would anything else. So here I am on WSL running Linux on Windows. I've just done a pull and I brought this down, and there's that change that we just saw. There's that change that I made last week, that small razor page. And then you'll notice I'm using the same prompt. I'm using Oh My Posh, and I really like Oh My Posh for .NET developers because you can see the version of .NET, but you can also put your Azure subscription there, or maybe if you work for one of the Azure government or one of the sovereign clouds, you can actually see which Azure that you're currently logged into. So having a nice prompt is cool. And in this case, I'm sharing my prompt between Ubuntu and WSL. So here we are on 6. I'm going to type in .NET -- version. Let's go ahead and zoom in and do that again. I can see I'm on 60113. Then I can type .NET -- info. And you can see we are on Ubuntu Linux. I'm on Ubuntu 22, so not too old, x64, and then we can see the location of the SDK. So this is confirmation. If anyone thought we were running this out of C program files, whatever, no, we're not. We can also, if we want to prove it, go which.net, and we can see that that's in userbin.net. Well, if I switched over into Windows, I could type where.net, and it would tell me it was in program files. So that's .net on the Windows side, and this is .NET on the Ubuntu side, which means that I could then go .NET build and build that now freshly brought down version of .NET, which is cool. So check that out. So that just came down. Now remember that Docker file. I'm running Docker. I can run Docker on Windows in both Linux and Windows because Docker Desktop shares that context. And that's really cool because if I bring up Visual Studio and I open up the Hanselman's website, we're going to have a couple of different options. And that tooling is going to make things more possible than ever before. So here is the website inside of Visual Studio. When I pull this down, check this out. We've got Kestrel, or just running the project directly. We've got IIS Express for folks that are still using IIS in Windows. I have that option. And then I've got WSL. I can go and hit F5, and I'm in Windows running Visual Studio 2022, Visual Studio Senior, Visual Studio Proper, the big one. Look at all this great tooling. I've got my Git support over here. I've got a lot of tests that are happening, all the new folding stuff. Check this out. This is really cool, actually. So this is something a lot of people haven't turned on yet. Look up here in the corner. You see my line numbers? You know how sometimes you start scrolling and you lose context and you're like, where am I? Watch. I'm scrolling down in Visual Studio. See how the line numbers just went 1 and then 10? So if I'm right here on setup or right here on test, look, I'm on line 39, but I know I'm in this method on that class on that namespace. Isn't that cool? That's an option you can turn on in Visual Studio right now. I'm on Visual Studio Preview. It's the public preview of Visual Studio Community. You can use this as well. But I wanted to point out that WSL support is built right in. Now I'm going to go back out to the command line here, and I want to just remind us that I can say Docker images, and we can say Docker PS and see that nothing is running. I made a little batch file. I used to call them batch files because I'm old, but they're really just PowerShell scripts. And these PowerShell scripts are not very fancy. Why would I make a PowerShell script called Docker build? Well, what it's doing is it's using what's called a shebang or a hash bang. That's a hash, that's a bang. And that's saying in Linux, I want you to go and look at the environment and use PowerShell. So PowerShell isn't in this context being used as a shell, it's being used as a scripting language. That line, that first line is ignored on Windows and it's used on Linux, which means I can use these scripts on both Linux and on Windows. So that means that I can go Docker build. Actually, this is assuming I have PowerShell on this new machine. I hope I do. I do. This is a brand new computer that I just built with Damien a couple of days ago, so bear with me. So this is the first time on this new machine that I've ever run this Docker build. So this is going to be interesting to see if this works, because the whole point of Docker is for these things to build reliably, isn't it? So what we're doing is we're building each of those layers. You can see that we're doing a .NET Restore right now. So that's going to be a network dependent thing. So that's going to go as fast as NuGet possibly can. That .NET Restore looks like it's done. That's coming down pretty fast. And I can actually look at the task manager if I want to see what's happening. You can see that Docker is doing that network work, bringing that information down. Now we're going to do the build. The build is happening inside of the Docker container, already done. The publish is happening. Look, so now Docker images, there's the podcast 6 seconds ago. Okay, now we'll say Docker run from Linux. Go ahead and pop that up. And then look at that. Now, let me open up another Ubuntu over here. I'll say Docker PS. There it is. Sweet. Satoshi. 10 seconds ago from port 8000 to port 80. I've got my application running. And then if I wanted to, as my finale, say Docker test. We've already done the first layers. So you can see here that all of this work already happened. So that just jumped immediately to the next stage. And in this context, it's going to then install Playwright, finish my tests. And if I feel good about this, I could then check it in. It'll go and run in Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. And because it's in a container, I have the choice of how I host it. And then if I bring it over again to Azure, I've got the choice of doing it on Azure Web Apps, Azure App Service rather, in a Docker container, or exploring other options. All in this case slapped into a single Linux plan, working nicely, working hard, and I feel good about it working hard because I'm saving money. See if I can fit some more in there. And in fact, I have a couple of plans. If we go to my app service plans, got my blood sugar, I got my Linux, I got my default Windows Server farm. And in that one, I'm actually using a basic pricing tier, and I've got 6 sites like babysmash.com and some of those smaller sites, which is pretty cool. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. Let's run back over here. We can see that we're just installing Playwright. I'll let that finish. It's probably going to take longer than we have time for. But we've got a whole fun day planned for you, my friends. Lots of cool demos from lots of cool people that are going to be showing you how the maybe the real friends are the tooling that we made along the way. There's a lot of great stuff, whether it be Visual Studio Code, or whether you like to drive stick shift. So I'll bring James and Haley back to come and hang out with me.
Awesome. It's always great to see how you code, Scott. It always inspires me and a lot of people. I shared your article to Oh My Posh, which is great. I always inspire to have a terminal like you one day. I think you answered quite a lot. When I grow up, I want to be just like Scott's terminal. A lot of good questions came in from the chat. We do have another minute or two, but I think you actually answered a few of them. But You did answer specifically why and how you develop not only with WSL, but from Windows with multiple tools. Of course, you could do that on a Mac or on Linux machine, wherever you're at. Someone was asking, you decided to host them on Linux App Service, which you did answer. You can double down on that and double click, if you will, Microsoft phrase. But is there any, they were asking specifically about, like, if they're running on different operating systems, are there any gotchas? Like, they're
Oh,
different
yeah.
OSs, you know?
That is a fantastic question. Right. So they're asking, you develop your apps on Windows. Why do you host them on Linux plans? So I'm hosting it on, I'm developing it on Windows because I like Windows. I enjoy the I enjoy Windows, and I feel that it is the year of the Linux desktop on Windows. I'm finding that as a shell, Windows works great. I can run my Linux apps. I can run my Linux GUI apps, but I am developing on Windows, but I'm developing on Linux on Windows. So in fact, I compile and test on Windows. I compile and test on Linux using WSL. So I know that it's going to run because I ran it on real Linux on my Windows machine. That is not an emulator. That is real Linux. By the way, if you bring my screen back up, I want to show you two things very briefly. You can see that my tests pass, both my unit tests and my Playwright browser tests all passed, running entirely in Linux, so that I know this site will run in production because I just did it on Linux. So Windows, as my favorite place to do development, gives me all of that flexibility, and it gives me choice. So to the individual's question, if I move it to a different host, if I want to run it on Windows, if once I got it running on Docker and on Linux, my choices opened up, and I can even bring up a version of the Hanselman It's podcast website. You can go ahead and unshare my screen now, and I could go and bring it on a Raspberry Pi Kubernetes cluster. I have proven that my website runs on Linux well enough that it runs on Raspberry Pi, and I can scale it across my little cluster. And what are the gotchas? Don't call the registry. Don't use backslashes, right? Don't call Windows APIs. So what you do is you write portable code, and we actually have the .NET Portability Analyzer that allows us to go and do that across multiple versions, as well as across multiple operating systems.
I love it. Scott, John has this great thing about the Playwright was running ASCII art progress bars rule. I think that is 100% correct. Here's a good one, actually, from Shaul is, do you have any tips on being a presenter? And I know that you do.
The way that you are trying to be a good presenter is try to be as empathetic as possible. And as I'm making my moves, as I am going here and going there, in my head, I'm thinking, James is watching and he's saying, well, so what? Now that seems like an aggressive thing to say, so what, so what? But each moment, each step, oh, you're running on Linux? Well, so what? Well, hang on, that's in an Azure App Service plan. Well, so what? So that moves the conversation forward because I'm thinking, well, what is someone who's not at the command line? I know that you're not a command line person. We joke about that. That's fine. Some people like the command line. Some people like Visual Studio Code. Some people like Visual Studio. So I'm trying to think about all of those different people and then making sure that as I build that presentation through line, you remember all of the callbacks. I'm rolling backwards and I'm going, and that relates directly to what we talked about 30 seconds ago, which relates to what we talked about at the very beginning of the talk, which is all about using the tools that make you happy and make you feel productive.
Yeah, it's fun to watch through the process, because as folks are coming in and asking questions, you're asking those questions to yourselves and answering them as well. And you don't even know what people are asking, but that comes up naturally because what would they ask? Additionally, may I recommend hanselman.com, scroll to the bottom under speaking, there is speaking videos and presentation tips on there. I will say, before I joined Xamarin over 10 years ago, I did take Scott Hanselman's masterclass before it was called the masterclass in presenting. I was way back in the days, like coffee scripts or something like that. It was really fun.
We did that on Pluralsight, and I'm actually going to be at Pluralsight Tech Days next week on the 20th. So check out Pluralsight Tech Days. It's going to be free. And actually, bring up my screen real quick to John Galloway. You know, people are talking about 3D VR, but let me tell you, give me a nice ASCII progress bar, and I'll be impressed. So John Galloway and I are very excited. If there's any kind of ASCII art at the command line with emoji, I've got blog posts on how to do that work inside of .NET, so we can bring you ASCII progress bars.
Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your presentation. And I got to go get my terminal all up and looking awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day and see you later, Scott.